Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I come to New Orleans 1 week a month from our Los Angeles office, and it's always a treat to come back to the birthplace of jazz. I always learn so much from the music that's being played here now and the music that's coming up from the young people in this town. And what I'm going to do today is talk about how to maximize your time in getting jazz in your classroom, whether that's jazz in your social studies and American history classroom to help generate jazz audiences for the future, or if it's in your big band, or if it's in your combo. And I do clinics all over the country. I go in and I look at and listen to jazz bands all over, 50 states. And I also teach at the Jamie Aebersold Summer Jazz Camp every summer. And it never ceases to amaze me. By the way, I'm a bassist. It never ceases to amaze me when the bass players come in for their audition for placement to see if they're going to be in combo 1, combo 10, combo 30, combo 40. We rate them. So we put the best kids with the best kids and the less experienced kids with the less experienced kids, so they all get to play in a combo of their peers. So we asked the bass player, first of all, a couple of questions like, hey, how's it going? How are you? Where are you from? Try to make them relax. How old are you? 17. Tell me a little bit about your jazz experience. Well, I've been playing in my jazz band since 7th grade. So I've been playing in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th. I've been playing 5 years. I'm going into my senior year. And so I'll say, okay, why don't we just start with having you walk a blues? And please walk a blues. And they go, well, what do you mean? And I'll say, well, can you walk a blues? And which is one of the most fundamental things you need to do as a bass player. They go, no. Then I'll give them some chord symbols. Can you walk with these chord symbols? No, all I do is read the notes. Same thing happens with piano. Been playing in jazz band for 5 years. They're playing triads and basic 7th chords. Same thing with the guitar players. The guitar players come in and they've got the guitars down to here and they're playing rock and roll bar chords, completely inappropriate for jazz. And you say, well, how long have you been playing in jazz band? Sometimes it's 3, 4 years. So what I want to do today is show you how you can maximize your time to get these players to, first of all, understand what jazz is. Sometimes I ask, what's a chorus? And they've been playing in jazz band for 4 or 5 years and they don't know what a chorus is. So the very first step, and this would be your first day of class. This would be your first day of class, whether you're teaching musicians or non-musicians, you tell them what jazz is. Now, of course, there's volumes written on what jazz is, but the main thing that you want to get across is the basic essence of what jazz is about and the basic musical elements of jazz. Even for your non-music students, and I've done this for 5th graders and they get it, because the idea is that if they understand what's going on in a jazz performance musically, even if they don't know, how to voice chords or play an instrument, but they understand what's going on, they're much more likely to appreciate jazz more and be more of a jazz connoisseur and have their lives enriched through this great art form. So the very first thing you want to tell your students is that jazz is America's music, that jazz was born in this country, that jazz evolved, was invented by and evolved through the African-American experience in America. Now, a lot of people think that jazz came from Africa. That's not true. True, African-Americans were the primary innovators of this music. But the music didn't come from Africa. The music came from America, and you want to emphasize African Americans. So in a nutshell, what jazz is, it's a marriage between two musical traditions, between the African musical tradition and the European musical tradition. So what you have is you have certain elements coming from the African tradition and certain elements coming from the European tradition. Well, what do you get from Africa? The first thing you get from Africa is the rhythms that you hear in jazz, the polyrhythms, the syncopated rhythms, the rhythms on top of rhythms. That is an African tradition. The other element that you get from Africa is the sensibility of playing in your own distinct voice. In classical music, for instance, if you're auditioning for a job in the New York Philharmonic and you sound different than everybody else in the section, in other words, if your bow's going north while theirs are going south, and you can stand out that this person's really not blending, you're not going to get that gig. But in jazz, you want to have your own personal voice. So a jazz musician will play in his or her own personal way, and that sensibility comes from Africa. Well, what do you get from Europe? Well, the first thing you get from Europe are the chords that you hear in jazz, the chord progressions, the harmony. Those are basically Baroque. They're basically Bach. Basically, what jazz musicians say is that the harmony in jazz is just hipped up Bach. You take Bach, you hip it up, you got jazz progressions. And also the instruments primarily come from Europe, the instruments that are used in jazz, the saxophone, the piano, the clarinet. These are all instruments that were invented in Europe. And then the element of improvisation, while it mostly comes out of the African tradition, because the African tribes, when they were playing their percussion, they weren't reading charts. They didn't have, there wasn't a conductor up there. But improvisation actually comes from both traditions, because Europeans, classical musicians back in Bach and Beethoven and Mozart's days, they improvised. When Beethoven would do a concert, half his concert would be improvised. So the element of improvisation comes from both traditions. So what do you get from Africa? You get the rhythms and the polyrhythms and the syncopation, rhythms on top of rhythms. You also get the sensibility of having your own personal expression. What do you get from Europe? You get the instruments, you get the chord progression, and you get improvisation from both elements. Now, how did jazz start? Well, jazz is about 100 years old, and it started right here in New Orleans about 100 years ago. Now, a lot of people ask me, they say, you know, who is the most important person in jazz history? And I'll say, well, who do you think? And they might say, Louis Armstrong, maybe, Duke Ellington. I say, no, the most important person in jazz history was Thomas Edison. Because what did Thomas Edison do? Well, he invented the electric lights. And if you have electric light, you can stay out at night. And if you stay out at night, you can party. And if you party, what do you need? You need a band. So New Orleans was a perfect place to have jazz originate, because it was a port city where you had all these ethnicities coming together. It was a party city, so you needed to have bands to play. And so what you did was you had these musicians from these different traditions playing together and improvising, and you add in a little blues, and you add in a little gospel, and you add in a little soul, and you improvise around these European chords, and you have the European instruments, and you do it with your own personal self-expression, and you do syncopated rhythms on top of syncopated rhythms, and poof, jazz was born. So that's how jazz started. Now, there's 5 basic elements of jazz that you want to let your students know, and you do this on the first day. Notice I took just about 5 or 10 minutes to do that, to give them the essence of what jazz is about, what they're about to hear, and then we start talking about the musical elements of jazz. Now, the first musical element of jazz is syncopation. Now, and before I talk about syncopation, notice that there's 5 elements of jazz here. And I just want to say this, of these 5 elements of jazz, most jazz has most of these elements most of the time. Not all jazz has all these elements all the time.